everyone. Let me just read this introduction, I guess. We study HEMA texts in translation, but when we talk about them, we use German words, and we use English words in unfamiliar ways. We're all used to how the translated texts sound, but that's not how Meyer sounded or how Lichtenauer sounded. It's how a translator has made them sound now. We pass those changes and decisions on to each other, and now we all have this expectation that effect book translation has this particular sound. We've immersed ourselves in a mix of foreign words and weird-sounding English. But are we bringing ourselves closer to the masters, or are we creating a new dialect of English that then other people have to learn in order to study with us? A little background on me and how I came to these particular ideas. I started HEMA in 2001 in Jeffrey Forgang's study group that was going over his first translation of the Meyer text. So I got exposed to only the English terms and a slightly old version. Since then, I translated Latin for Paulus Hector Meyer using mostly freely available online resources and self-taught techniques. And it's only recently that I've looked at other German sources and talked to scholars outside my own group. So I've learned a lot about what's not universal in HEMA and which communication barriers are bigger than I expected. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is the choices that translators make. This is in part to expose some of the translation process so you guys can see it, but also I'd like to help you all make more informed choices about how you interact with and use the translated texts. So I hope to equip you all to make more intentional choices about texts and understand the implications of the choices that you do make. Why is this important to talk about? When we disagree about the meaning of a passage, and we're talking about little fiddly words, it's not the original text. What we're disagreeing about is my reading of a translator's interpretation and understanding and choices about the text. So some examples of this are things like, if we get into a whole big discussion about what movement should you do when the text says step, or spring, or leap, or go? Are all of those different? Are they different in the German? It's a little important to know when that's the point of contention and conflict. Or things like, is a target near, or toward, or to, or against, or by? Those are all choices that the translator has made, and without knowing the underlying German, all we can do is argue about the translation. When the translation is using non-standard English, some of the burden of translation choices comes on to us to then interpret this middle level that's English, but not really exactly English. So the more specific things I'll be talking about today are translation style, technical term choices, so whether to do English sounds like German, German, benefits and methods for studying original texts, and a few examples of cool things you can learn by looking at the original language. And as a fun Easter egg, I've called this slide index, which we now know as the index at the back of a book. In Paulus Hector Meyer's day, index did not yet mean that. So when it says index librorum, it's actually the pointer of this book. The index is the thing that points out where all the things are. The most important thing to know about translation style is that literal translation is a myth. There's no way to translate something from one language to another and not add interpretation. You can change as little as possible. You now get a thing that's really hard to use. English with German word order is not a useful study text. If you change too much, however, you lose things that were present in the German. So you can smooth it out, but you've now smoothed out things that you were supposed to stop and think about, and they were written ambiguously on purpose. Maybe. It's hard to tell. But between those two extremes, there's a lot of space, and translators hopefully make a consistent choice across the whole work, but translators will make a call each time they encounter a challenge about whether to go more smooth or more close. I didn't call it close, but maybe a close but not literal translation. If you can figure out which of those styles or where on that continuum your favorite study text is, you can then have sort of a filter for how much of what you're reading is the translator's choice and how much is coming from the original text. What does that look like? Here's two translations of the same passage. The Forgang as it appears in the printed book, and Rasmussen as it appears on Wichtenauer. Those may be too tiny to read. I'll just read the middle bullet because it's shorter. So Forgang writes, "Next, to explain and interpret this vocabulary so that everyone may properly understand what is meant by this manner of speaking." Rasmussen translates the same sentence. After that, explain these terms so that everyone may understand what is meant by them. And the first bullet, you can see there's a lot more extra in Forgang, but they're translating the same passage. But to get into what I mean about the Hema dialect, here's the same Rasmussen. Here's my modern edit, so I don't read the German. This is not a retranslation, but I believe I have not changed the meaning of that. I've just used more modern words and grammar. So that same middle bullet. After that, I will explain the terms so that everyone may understand what they mean. It's a little more straightforward. And in case that seems like too radical an edit, take it one step further. This is a little more like what that would look like if I took it to my day job and did a technical writer edit on it and got rid of all the unnecessary stuff. Next, I will explain the terms so their meanings are clear. This is probably too far for a translation, but for a Hema study group, especially if you're teaching newcomers or beginning students, it could make sense to do an edit of your study text that looks a little more like this, so that when you're reading it in class, people aren't being bogged down by extra words, having to untangle the grammar or deal with those pairs of descriptors that these authors really love. What do we gain by having this Hema dialect? The translation process goes a little faster and easier. When I'm doing a translation in Latin, I have to keep doing more passes and more so that the first one is translationese, and the second one is still not really English, and the third one is this Hema dialect. And then someone looks at it and says, "Kendra, this is not English yet." So if I stop at that Hema dialect point, I can save myself some time and effort, but I'm just offloading it onto you. When we have this Hema dialect, and it sounds all oldie-fashioned, but not too much, when we study it, we feel like we're uncovering treasure. And that's cool, and that's a totally okay choice to make. That, if I know my audience wants that experience, I can then make my translation a little less simple and direct. If it were too easy, we wouldn't value our study of it as much. When you work hard to get meaning out of something, it's then really important to you. And if you don't have to work hard, it means less. We kind of like that our studies are wrapped up in cryptic words. We get this kind of family feel like an in-group. We've all worked on the same cryptic words, and that's cool. And that too is okay, as long as we recognize that it does create this us and them barrier for newcomers. What do we lose with this Hema dialect? We lose some clarity. That's sort of inevitable. The basic comparison I'm making is that that style is less clear. It's harder to teach because you have to teach the students how to read the text as it's been translated and then convert that into their own understanding. It raises the entry bar. It also makes following along by ear harder. I'm sure you guys have all done where someone reads out loud and someone walks through the motions, but you have to listen and then process and then wait for the next action word to come around because it's, you hold your hand up and you hold it up so high and then you turn it, and then while he does some stuff and you have to wait for all those clauses to go by. Reading out loud at a natural pace, also really hard. But what about the cryptic words? Isn't this supposed to be hidden in cryptic words? I'm sure you've all encountered Shakespeare's texts where it now, to us, is really hard to read, but it was supposed to be vulgar. And that's kind of the same thing that's happening here, except that it's artificial because it's a translation. So by having the translated version be more like how Shakespeare feels to us, we're adding distance between us and the text and making it less clear and harder to understand. Which is important to note also because not all of our original texts were written in the same way. Some of them were written more for personal notes. Some were written to teach from. Meyer's book, he knows he's writing to mass produce it. So most of his readers are going to be people he's never met that don't have sword teachers. His style is going to be necessarily different from the person who's writing their own notes in a house book. But when we translate them all into hemodialect, you lose that distinction. It's much harder to see. Also, the Zettel is cryptic. It's supposed to be the cryptic words. The glosses were written because it was cryptic, and someone needed to explain it, and so they wrote down their explanation. That explanation should be less cryptic. And Meyer, whatever we think of his writing style, he was almost certainly not writing cryptically, because he knows he has this audience of people he's never met and total randos off the street, and he's trying to reach them. So his writing will be how he would speak to them, maybe, or what he thinks is accessible. So to move on to the choices that we make about terminology. So most of you, I think, are not translators, but we all talk about the texts, and we make decisions about how we talk about them. And I know one of the big ones is, do we use the original terms or the English? My short answer for you is, use what makes you happy for you when you're the one who matters. When you're working with other people, think about them and what will be best for them. Because if you're teaching knowing that your students don't understand you, you're not really teaching. So if your audience doesn't follow the German because it sounds foreign or because they just don't know the terms, probably best not to use German terms with that audience. But for an audience who does use German terms, if you don't, they now can't access your material. So you need to give them some kind of a bridge. If you use English and your audience uses different English, you again need to give the German terms to connect them. Otherwise, you'll be having to guess to figure out which of my English words and your English words should match. This is my opinion, but untranslated terms, you're asking the student to learn gibberish, basically. It's, gibberish from German, but if they don't know German, they have to learn new pronunciation, new sounds, and then figure out the meaning and connect it to that. English terms that feel close to the German are very popular. Things like winden is winding, which is easier on the student because they're learning English, but they're still not learning a meaning. They're learning a code word and a meaning separately and having to connect them. So what we're doing when we make that choice, like winding for winden, without looking deeper, is prioritizing superficial similarity. And necessarily, if you prioritize one thing, everything else becomes less important. So we're essentially discarding meaning in many cases. Which means that the students have to learn three things now: the term, the concept, and something that connects them. My recent encounter with this was a class that was describing lower hangers, which I'm sure you guys have all seen. I'd never heard that word used for that thing before and expected hanging to mean this, which is how Meyer uses the word hang. And I was given an explanation that clearly connected the two, that if you think of your opponent as down, like the enemy gate is down, then in all of the hangers, your sword points towards your opponent. But now I have to remember that every time I hear the word hang. So it slows down the process, even once I get used to it. On the other hand, I believe we can all make thoughtful choices about which English to use, either which translation or finding our own English preferred terms, so that you have a word where the English meaning relates to the concept for the sword fight. And then your students can learn one English word that they probably already know and remember how that connects to the concept without needing the bridge in between or the difficulty of strange German spelling. Which has the important benefit, nope, not a benefit. I read all the things I wrote. If I come up with my own English versions of everything that make beautiful sense to me, I can explain them to you. But if I then teach that to my students and send them out into the world, they now can't talk to anyone else because they have only my version of the words, which means that in my class I should be showing my word and the German word that lies underneath it, so that then when they go out into the world they can match up with whoever they're talking to. What's the German concept and what are the different words they're using? Are you all familiar with the phrase, verbing weirds language? Comes from Calvin and Hobbes. The idea being, when you take words that aren't verbs and you use them as verbs, you can sort of communicate, but also very weird things are happening. And I see that happening a lot in HEMA, because we take the German terms, and then we use them as whatever part of speech is convenient, disregarding what part of speech it was in German, whether it's an adjective that needs a noun to go with it, or a verb that should be done to something. There will be an example of this coming up. Which raises the question, if we weren't using those German terms, if we were using English terms that represented how Meyer wrote his German, would it help us talk about the actions the way Meyer talks about them? There is no easy answer here. This is one of the hardest parts of translating, is finding the one English word that's going to match all the ways that the related German word is used throughout the entire text. The one that comes up most is how is the cut, or a hew. But that needs to be a word where I can cut at you, or I can deliver a cut to you, or when I see your cut coming in. All of those are different, and hew doesn't work the same in those sentences. So even when we cheat, there's no easy way out on that one. So what does that look like? Here are some examples of ways you could talk about the crump, the crooked cut. So here's the German word being used in the English sentence as different parts of speech. Vorgang calls it crooked. But which of these is what's meant by the German when they use crump as a verb? The Latin in Paulus Hector Meyer's pseudo-Peter von Danzig gloss uses curve instead, curvus. I'll get into more detail about this one later, but bend is also a way you could translate this word. And cut bent doesn't make a lot of sense, but bend a cut to the flat is an interesting way of looking at it, and we lose that when we just say crump to the flat. So having said all of that, I know that, I don't know why I closed my notes there, I'm going to need those. I know that not everyone is a translator, and not everyone has access to translation resources, but translation resources are actually, if you put a little curiosity and effort into it, not that hard to find. There's some on the internet. I do all of my translating with no institutional affiliation, so I don't have special university dictionaries. I have one because I bought it myself, but most of what I use is online resources. And that's also true of my co-translator, who is a professional translator, and she has 2 dictionaries, I think, that she uses in real physical space, and then about 5 that are free online, including the Grimm Dictionary of Early Modern German. So, knowing that all of you are not translators, if you wanted to get closer to the original text, these are some ways that you can without doing a full-on translation project. I showed examples of this one. Edit passages to fit your group study style. So if you're going to be reading it out loud, create your own version for reading out loud and present it that way. Say, this is your edit of Meyer's words. But that way you're not having to deal with if you don't want his gendered pronouns in your text, or if you want to clip out all of the weird adverbs. You can do a short passage or a single sentence if you know some German and you're studying along and you find a really tough spot and you want to know more. pick out just that sentence and take as long as you need and pull it apart and chew on it. Find a HEMA translator to talk to. This is easier than it ever was before the age of the internet. Just ask around, see if someone can introduce you to someone who works on German or on the specific text you're interested in. This is the one that I hope I will inspire you guys all to do. Choose original terms that interest you and dig into them as deeply as you can. On the slightly more research light side, find a different English translation of the text you normally study and compare the two and see how they differ and what you can learn from it. And with your clubmates, with your students, talk about when you can see that a translator has made a choice. Point that out and talk about what it means. And now examples. These I hope will be slightly more fun. The Zwerch. I know you've all seen the Zwerch, which Forgang translates as thwart because it's sort of etymologically similar. But what does it mean? What does thwart actually mean? When you tell a student to do a thwart cut, are they thinking, I've been foiled, you've thwarted my plan? Or are they thinking of the thwart that's part of a fortification? Probably not. They're thinking of the archaic adverb athwart. You know, he rode his horse athwart the field. Probably not. Rasmussen does it as cross, which has more English meaning packed into it. From the Latin pseudo von Danzig, transversario, which goes very nicely into transverse, which is a little clearer than athwart for moving across something, but also what does that really mean? You know, if you tell someone, do a transverse cut, it's got more letters than it has meaning, really. Vinden has been a fun one to discuss in our study group at home because everyone knows Vinden is winding. Because Vinden looks like winding. What is it really? We started thinking about this a lot harder after talking to Jess Finley, who has been studying hunting lexicon, and found that Vinden is when the animal you're chasing is going back and forth across the path you expected from side to side. It's also a winding road, in the sense that we have winding road in English. Going to one side and back again, it's the way a sailboat tacks across the wind. So those all have a similar underlying meaning that you can see when you lay them all out next to each other like that. That is not present in just the word winding. But to throw a total wrench into all of this, the Latin gives intorsio. And if you look up intorsio in the dictionary, what you see is twirling hair, curling hair with a curling iron, and cooking bacon.
That's how I do my winding. It's like bacon, really.
But as with the German, think about those. What do all of those have in common that they've ended up on this one word? And all of those things are you hold a thing in your hand and you turn it like this. You can twirl your hair. You can roll your hair with a curling iron. You can flip bacon over. This word also is used to mean roll your eyes at someone and lob a grenade at them. But those seem less relevant. But here's a case where by comparing the German and the Latin and other contemporary uses of the German term, we can create sort of a triangulation around what is the Platonic essence of Vinden with no specific single word attached to it. How can we combine that side to side and that twisting with the wrist into a sword action? Crump I showed an example of before, which Forgang does as crooked. Rasmussen has it as the arc, and Latin has it as curvus. And the arc and the curve makes some sense. Anyone who's done this action goes like this. Crooked comes from the underlying senses in German of something that should have been straight, but now it isn't. Something that you were expecting to go straight and didn't. Something that's sneaky. Something that's sort of off the straight and narrow. These are paraphrases of hearing my co-translator reading very long dictionary entries. But so from all of these, my suggestion was, can we call it bent, like a bent politician, or a bent arrow? The problem with that is that Latin tells us the curve is important, the rounded shape, also present in arc, and bent doesn't have that sense in English, making this just sort of an awkward tie. Here are things you can learn by looking at words really hard. And my last example, Sprechfenster, which appears in Meyer. Maybe it's not the same technique or concept at all, but it's an unmistakably similar word, Brechfenster, break the window. In other German sources, we have Sprechfenster, which means speaking window. And that sounds simple enough. But if you look under the surface of that a little bit more, you've all seen in medieval set movies where there's the big door, it's pouring rain, and the traveler comes up outside the castle gate, and he bangs on the door, and the gatekeeper opens this tiny little thing, and it's just his eyes that you can see. And that's a Sprechfenster. Sprechfenster is also the window of an anchorite, someone who is a religious hermit who has been bricked into a house and has one small window where they can talk to the outside world, and people deliver food to them through this one small window, is also a Sprechfenster. So it's communication, but through a very narrow area, which gets weird when we go to the Latin, which has patula fenestra. Patula, you may recognize from the kitchen tool spatula, a spreading tool. Patula is wide open, which is also communication. You've made an opening in something, and you're passing information through it, but it's big. You can pass lots of information. I don't know what that means, really, what that difference is. I haven't done my third pass over the patula fenestra section to see what other meanings are hiding in there. Like the Sprechfenster.
There is one funny thing here with Meyer. First of all, he uses both spellings. So, but I think Mike is it Goliath said as well?
Is who, what?
Goliath who also has the Brechfenster. Because that's I think it's
Parnfein has Brechfenster. You're right. I don't think it appears earlier than Parnfein. I have to go back and look. I don't recall it earlier.
So I have a memory that
16th century.
It's incomplete spelling, so it has Brechfenster, but it's supposed to be Brechfenster as well, stylized. I think, but that might be one cause of the confusion of this.
Right. So we talked about before that it could be over time people reading and interpreting the written word as opposed to speaking it. In which case, an S can turn into a B. But I don't know how persuasive that entirely is, because a lot of the scripts, it's not similar enough that you make that mistake, especially when there's no teaching attached to it that could justify it.
But this was a different thing. This was like, they were supposed to write Sprechfenster, but they only wrote Brechfenster. The big S wasn't done yet. They never completed the page. So it was a big stylized S that was supposed to be added at a later stage.
So the initial was missing.
Yeah. So,
I have to go. I can go look for examples of that.
That's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. Matthew has asked that I pause so he can change microphone.
Yeah, I've been working on that. A good news version of Meyer. If Organs is the King James and Meyer. There's
Can I
lots
fit it
and
on a
lots of
postal
choices.
card?
What's that?
Can I fit it on a card that I can hand people on the street?
Do you know Meyer? Would you like to? But there's many cases of the translator's choice that I'm like, He picked a safe one, but it didn't describe the thing as accurately as other period things. And one of my go-to examples is Dempton, Howe. It is clearly suppressing within the language, but also in military texts of the period and beforehand, it meant you can suppress an enemy. They didn't use Dempton. They were using impede or repel the movement. So impede is probably, like, I think, given the action of what you're doing, a better word choice. But you have to explain that, like you said, you've got to explain that. So we don't know everything about every translation of every word yet.
Another example in Forgan.
So
I'm sorry, I don't know this is a Q&A, but I'm going to take a tiny soapbox instead, which is how these Q&As tend to go at this event, isn't it? I was talking with Jack Gassman at Long Point, and he was complaining about translation styles because he says what Kendra talked about is the close translation versus what's the opposite of the close translation? Smooth. And so he was talking about, he phrased it as a source-oriented versus reader-oriented translation. Are you trying to get as close as possible to what the book is or what the reader will understand? And the source-oriented in academic settings is expected to be hard to read and really complicated with footnotes and everything and like bad word order, but just trying to express and just render it into the new language as opposed to explaining it. And he says, HEMA translators stick with the source, with the close translation, as long as they know as long as they understand it. And as soon as they get confused, you can tell because they depart from the close translation and go completely reader-oriented, and they just basically almost make something up. But you get weird metaphors that are not even close to what the book says because it's the best they could do in explaining it. And then after that hard sentence, they go right back to the close translation again. So it's this weird back and forth, unevenness. An example that we saw, Kendra and I, we were looking at the Tverhau in Forgang, and he makes a statement that if you didn't have the Tverhau in modern combat, then half of all fighting would go out the window. And if you look at the German, there's no window in that paragraph. There's no, like, most of those words are completely him making it up. And what it actually says is, it would be like having half of your fencing. But he didn't like that. So he decided to make it much more flowery and give you this thing that sort of expresses the idea, but compared to the rest of that section of the translation, is a complete departure from his style, because he couldn't make it sound good to say that you only have half fencing. And when you look at Kevin's translation of the equivalent paragraph in the 1568, he went with the more direct of it says half fencing, and that's what it says, and that's what Meyer called it, but Forgang just couldn't bring himself to say that, so he made up something else that kind of sounded better in his mind. And he does that a lot, and a lot of published translations do that a lot, because it does make it easier to read, but because the rest of the time you're doing close translation, you can't tell where they're departing and coming back to the close reading of the text. It's not like he says...
You often can't tell. Yeah. That one's pretty clear.
That one was pretty obvious with the German next to it. But often, you have no idea when this specific paragraph is flowery stuff that the translator created, and the paragraphs before and after it are as close to the German as they could make it, unless you have an ear for, that doesn't sound very German, and then you start to get the hint.
But it seems important to note that the problem there is not that he used an idiom to represent an idea from the German, because sometimes that's really important. When I worked on the Florius text, the Latin Fiore, there was a page that had something about, when you throw him into the dirt and grind his face with his teeth or whatever, and then you will be made to the nails. Which has to be rendered as an idiom because it's an idiom. But if I just translated it straight that way, it means absolutely nothing at all. This was extra weird because the word for nails, fingernails, is the same as the word for hooves. So the first sense out of the dictionary, you will be made to the hooves.
Right.
But after a lot more digging, made to the nails is sort of like whatever that gesture is called, buffing your nails to show off how cool you are. So that it has to be an idiom, and it would be wrong to not translate it as an idiom. But the important thing is to choose one that carries over the intended underlying sense.
And part of the problem is if you're being inconsistent in the style, and so you're jumping around, and a reader doesn't know what parts of it are you and what parts of it are still partly you, but also mostly the original source. And they don't know how close you're getting in each sentence to the German because there's no pattern to it. And that makes it hard to actually learn the underlying language out of it. As a casual reader, there's not really any difference. I mean, you're going to enjoy it either way.
Is there a question from the back?
I was just going to comment maybe or ask, to what degree might it be Forgang's attempt to make the project more accessible or just read better so that people will want to read it, right? So, and when we're trying to decipher this stuff, generally we get uncomfortable ourselves when we don't understand things, and that's kind of, if I'm looking to publish a book and maybe sell a bunch of copies, I don't want the people reading it to like be cringing as they're reading it. I want them to read something that presumably makes sense in their minds.
Right. So the difference.
That is important. It may be what we're seeing there. The thing that's strange about the out the window example is that Forgang suddenly changes his method for appealing to the reader, because most of his book is not written in a sort of smooth and accessible way, especially when you start comparing it to other translations of the same text. And then in this one moment, he's decided to use a modern idiom. And so you're going along and da-da-da-da-da, and out the window. Like it really stands out because there's nothing else like that in the whole book.
Sure.
So, yes, translators should do that, but they should do it the same way for the whole project.
Yeah, Tom Leone, for example, is quite willing to say "fuck you" in Italian, and just make the Italian say whatever he wants it to. But a writer who's not doing that consistently creates a weird product, where sometimes it's going to be figurative flowers, sometimes it's going to be as literal as I can make it.
Other questions?
I'm just glad we use the technical terms normally when we explain stuff. We come here and we evaluate your understanding of the word.
German.
And yeah,
In German.
yeah, the German terms. Yeah. So I think that that's been a benefit to the way we've gone out as a group. We have the shared technical language of that.
So I do have a question for you. I'm really pleased to hear you talk about this, because I've struggled with similar things when teaching. And one of the struggles I have is at what rate or at what times do I introduce the more technical language or the German terms to students so that they can latch onto it and they can use it as like the vocabulary for this activity versus it being overwhelming and impossible to comprehend. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how you would go about doing that for new people.
I think my short answer for you is that's an education question.
Sure. Okay.
I'm just a translator.
Okay.
But I think you're right to worry about that. I would say the introduction, Meyer's introduction that I showed the passages from for the side-by-side comparison, actually talks about that a little bit. That it's this whole passage where he's saying, don't bombard your student with hard-to-understand words. You do them a disservice. You do the art a disservice. So Meyer may actually have some tips there.
Okay.
To just caveat on that, when you read the shtuk, how often does he say, perform a Kampal and then do this handwork and then that handwork? He's describing the actions, not the vocabulary term.
Right.
Most of the time.
Yeah, I noticed that, and that can be good and bad, but it's interesting. Cool. Thank you.
I had a thought, because you talked about how the writer tries to get, not the translate, but the original writer, and you mentioned Meyer specifically, and there's a change happening around the 15th century, switching from an oral tradition to a very distinctly written tradition, and the language changes distinctly, going from very simple conjunctions is not the word you use, right? And the word and.
That's a conjunction, yeah.
It is a conjunction, okay. And if you look at 32:27, it's und. And I'm not doing techno music now, it's literally conjunction, just adding to in sentences. Commonly using like 3 adjectives or three adverbs and so on. And then by Meyer's time, it's a completely different type of, different way of expressing oneself with dozens of subclauses and complicated and complex sentences. So that really changes the translation as well, I think, and the difficulty in that. So, yeah, just
What do you do when there's no word-for-word translation of a? Here's an example. I'm wrapping up a Heusler translation, and in it he's teaching Salvador Fabri, rapier, and dagger. Heusler was a student of Fabri. He used the terms prima, segunda, quarta, tertia. Those he uses, all of the terms caminar and finde and machen. But he's German, and then he'll italicize in his font that word finde. Well, several of those, it's impossible to go one word. So me as a translator saying, and perform a feint on him. Easy. Perform a finda, and do the finda, and then do this, this, and this. Well, there's some like Caminare, which if you read Reiner and Nortz and others translations of those, or Pierre Marco Terminiello, it's a whole paragraph. It's a movement. Caminare is a movement forward while doing this and this. So how do you do? What I did, and I would ask you, is it copacetic to English and then leave that? Like I said, perform a finda on him. Now, in my translation, I plan to I have an index or a word list, so that and I'm assuming the fencer who would potentially use this is going to know what a finda is. But what if they're brand new and they don't? And then it would be on them to look that up. So what do you recommend there?
That specific case is a weird example because your source text is using untranslated technical terms. So,
well, he also
you've got multiple
he
layers.
Translated them in the beginning as well. Von Schurfer, Hans-Wilhelm von Schurfer, and Häusler both have a page that I translated as well. And he's saying, Batieren is, we call this the stomp in German, where you lift your leg and stomp it. Yet here it's an Italian or Latin term. I'm hard pressed to say and stomp. So I like the Batieren. What do you think would be more effective? What's most effective?
We sometimes encounter those where it just seems so hard to find one English word, and the policy of me and my co-translator specifically is to say, no, that's cheating. We can't just leave it untranslated. Our job is to take this and put it into English. So if there's no one word that fits, we look for two words. Maybe it's a two-word phrase, maybe it's words in alternation. The example of this from the Suda von Danzig that comes to mind is the word habitus, which as a Latin word, it appears all over the place, and it means sort of a body, or what a body's doing, or all the things a body can do. And in the Pseudo-Danzig, we could not get it down to just one use. And what we ended up doing was choosing the pair posture and gesture, because clearly the problem we had was sometimes it means stand still, and sometimes it means move. And there's no middle ground there. One of them means not moving, one of them is moving. And so what we settled on was two specific words, one that covers each sense. But in the case of, you've got a whole paragraph that's this action that's been boiled down to one word.
It's a minimum sentence, a lengthy sentence.
Sure.
Conveying this action of moving.
But then I would say the thing to do is at that point, 2 generations earlier creator took this sentence and made one word for it. And that's what you should do also. You should have a word that represents all of that. Yeah. But it should be an English word that at least hints at it.
That's the trick, isn't it?
Yeah,
find some English
slap
word.
Slap a footnote on there or something that says, this word entails a whole bunch.
Yeah.
But it's still just a word. At least to the writer it was.
I found, maybe I took the lazy approach, but I found it easiest to leave it.
Yeah.
And then put the onus on you as the reader to say, you've got it. You're a rapierist. You're learning. You need to know what that is anyway. So learn when you come across, Caminare or Voltaire or any of those, you should know them. And it's not up to me to.
But I think the Meyer example of that, the Lichtenauer example would be index, is the one that literally everyone wants to just leave alone and not translate, because it's got so much packed into it. And in fact, totally unexpected funny story that came out of the Pseudo-Danzig project. The Latin translator looked at it and said, what the hell, I can't come up with a word for this. And translates that entire passage without the verse, never using a single word for indes. There is no equivalent in that translation of indes. No, it's not there.
Yeah, so he just skips over it every time and tries to explain around the word without saying it. So he doesn't leave it untranslated or translated. He tries to sidestep it every time.
Or even the place where there's the list of all the techniques, and he says, indes this, indes that, indes this, indes that. And in the Latin, it's the same list of all of the nouns, and they're all ablative. And that's it. So it's just ibus, 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 ibus. Which sort of gets at it, because ablative has that in the middle and applying and using. But he just skipped that word because he couldn't deal with it.
It's a long tradition.
One thing I would like to see sometimes in the translation is that, at least for the most ambiguous things that are hard to translate, have a footnote
Yes.
talking a little bit about that. One typical example in Forgang's Meyer is the Geschenken, which is really, I don't think it should be translated as crossed, which he does throughout the
But
book.
what is it translated as then? How would you translate it?
Probably more across, which is a different meaning. So it's like when you see it in heraldry, it's swords placed across a sheet, and that is where the confusion comes from, I think. The problem here is that in Meyer's text he says you keep your arms geschenkt and order gekreuzigten. That's what the text says. So Gag chose to sum that up as cross only. But there's an or in between there's two words. And that causes problem later in the text because he translates geschenkt alone as crossed as well. And that, I think, messes up the interpretations because we try to cross our arms when we really shouldn't. So a footnote there would have helped quite a lot.
Yes. I like footnotes and translations a lot.
Yeah.
You'd like to have another question? No?
I've got a copy of the Quran translated into English, and it's got like on each page, like this much at the top of the page is the text, and this much is footnotes.
Yeah. Which was that?
I don't know what translation it is.
Yeah.
But the Quran.
I think one more question, and then we should all go have lunch.
I was wondering, what do you think about this as a problem with translations, and that many translators don't necessarily seem to be fencers or martial artists, and they may not really understand the totality of an action encompassed by a word. Is that a problem for translators?
So, is it a problem to have
Well, they may
translators who are not fencers doing the translation?
Yeah, because it's a technical text.
Right.
And it would seem that, it would be helpful to have some technical background when you're trying to translate it.
I would not go so far as to say it's wrong or a problem for a non-fencer to be doing a fencing translation, but I do think that it's very wrong for someone working on a fencing book to do the translation without having two fencers and reading through every passage. Which is how I got into this, was being that group of fencers for Jeffrey Forgang. And I found it critical in my own work because that's how we catch things like, I made a mistake when I typed it and switched left to right. Or we can resolve when someone thinks, when there's a scribal error and it's been crossed out and someone changed it from left to right. We can play that out both ways and see which one of them works better. And check things like, if we wrote crossed, and you do the thing and your arms never actually cross, that was the wrong word. So I think for any translator from any background, they should be having at least two fencers to do that with. And that should hopefully smooth out any differences of background or reduce knowledge of the concepts in the text because they're testing it as they're writing it.
Do you know if Forgang follows that procedure?
He did for the Meyer. That I know for sure because I was there.
His more recent stuff, I don't think so. He
Yeah,
doesn't have a group anymore, as far as I know.
I got his book on Pietromonte too, and there's some technical terms in there that are just thrown in, like I think they're Italian, and it's kind of hard to understand a lot of that stuff. And you go to the back in the glossary, and the descriptions of what those things are supposed to mean are often confusing to me.
Right, yeah, I know he did for the 133 and the Meyer. The Monte, I think, is his most recent, or like second most recent, which is after he's been more distant from the fencing community. So I don't know that he didn't, but I know he no longer has the Sword Guild to do that with.
So just a brief sort of connection on that line, like my sort of grandfather club where I started doing sort of again was the Ann Arbor Sword Club, and Jeffrey Forgang is one of the founding members of the Ann Arbor Sword Club, and he is close friends with the guy who still runs it, Dave Hornstrip, and I know for a fact that they worked through translations physically with each other for decades before he ever even produced anything like personally. So he is a fencer when he has a mind.
Well, the things that trouble
Jeffrey certainly has fenced.
Yeah.
Well,
He was one of the founders of the Hickman Sword Guild.
Right.
the things that gave me a problem in the Monte book were primarily descriptions of wrestling actions.
Yeah.
And I just didn't get the sense he really understood what was going on. they just, I don't know.
Right.
And I found it hard to visualize what was going on in many of the activities. And they weren't primarily fencing, they were more
And I mean, to be clear, that wasn't a dig at Jeffrey
No, no.
and his but I mean, in the past 5 or 10 years, he's rearranged a lot of his lifestyle and is no longer involved with the fencing club, as far as I know, unless it's like a couple of guys who he meets with in a park.
Right.
He's not actually like anyone who is taking students or anything anymore, and he hasn't been since maybe 2008 or 10. As I understand it. So prior to that, he was a big fencer, but his Monte stuff particularly has been done since the Higgins closed, and he stopped doing any of those activities.
Right.
So that could be why that one in particular is a little harder to work through.
So, and also to your point, Jay, a lot of this stuff is tied together in ways that we don't necessarily tie them together today as recreators of the art. So, I mean, I would say the majority of fencers I know are not even skilled wrestlers, never mind competent to be able to be instructors in wrestling. I'm not saying that it's a huge majority. I'm not saying that there's only 5%, but I would say a simple majority of the fencers that I know.
And like that's most people.
And back then, they tied more things together than just wrestling and fencing. And the translators, whatever angle they're coming from, they're probably not coming from an angle that's comprehensive from the perspective of the author of the original source.
Right, and I think what we got here is that you should have some technical support or knowledge or something in doing this. And I don't mean to put down Forgang's translation of Pietro Monti. It's actually a really good book. There's a lot in there that's really useful. I recommend it. If you can afford it, it's pricey, then you should get it.
I just like sharing that I have a personal connection. That's all.
But buy the Forgang book, Pietro Monti. It's very interesting.
And you raise an interesting detail too for in this practice of do the translation and then have someone walk through it. You say having the fencers and wrestlers who are walking through it be experts is one thing because they'll be able to figure out what should be there based on the hints. But it can also be very important to do it with total noobs who are going to get it wrong if your translation isn't clear.
Yeah.
So doing 2 runs is probably the very best thing.